It was supposed to be an ordinary Halloween night in Napa Valley, a quiet town known for its vineyards, not its violence. But by sunrise, 2 young women were dead, their home turned into a scene of unthinkable horror, and their roommate, the only survivor, left to piece together what had happened. In the fall of 2004, Napa Valley was a portrait of calm. Rows of vineyards stretched across rolling hills, their leaves turning gold beneath the late October sun. The air smelled faintly of grapes and dust, and in the evenings, a quiet breeze carried the sounds of distant laughter from downtown. Crime was something that happened in bigger cities, far away from this small wine country town. Before that Halloween, there hadn't been a single homicide in over 2 years. At night, most homes sat in silence, their doors unlocked, and their porch lights glowing gently. Among those who called it home were 3 young women who had come to Napa for work, friendship, and a sense of independence. They were in their 20s, full of life, and determined to build their own futures. The house they shared sat on Dorset Street, a quiet residential area near downtown. It was a modest 2-story home with white trim, a tidy front yard, and a small wooden porch where they sometimes sat to talk after work. It was supposed to be their safe place, a small corner of calm in a peaceful town. The first 2 roommates were Lauren Mianza and Adrian Insogna. Lauren was 27, a strong and athletic woman with a background in political science. She worked as a volleyball coach at Napa Valley College and had been known for her focus and dedication. Adrian, 26, worked as a civil engineer for the city's sanitation district. Her co-workers admired her intelligence and steady nature. Adrian's life had not been easy. 10 years earlier, in 1994, she survived a devastating car crash while still in high school. The injury she suffered forced her to relearn how to walk, and the emotional toll took years to heal. But Adrian was tough. She refused to be defined by what she endured. By 2004, she had built a career, a circle of close friends, and a quiet strength that made people respect her. When Lauren and Adrian decided to rent the Dorset Street house together, it felt like a new beginning for both. They shared an understanding, 2 hard-working young women supporting each other as they navigated adulthood. Not long after settling in, they met Ben Katz, a friend of Adrian's who helped them move in. That same evening, a few more friends came over for pizza and laughter, including Lily Prudhomme, Adrian's best friend, and Lily's quiet boyfriend, Eric Koppel. Adrian was thriving at work, and Lily remained a close part of her daily life. By the summer of 2004, life inside the Dorset Street house was beginning to change. Adrian and Lauren had grown used to their quiet routines: morning coffee on the porch, long days at work, and the occasional dinner with friends. But in June, a new roommate moved in, bringing with her a different kind of energy. Her name was Leslie Matsara. Leslie had recently moved to Napa from South Carolina, drawn by the charm of California's wine country and the promise of new beginnings. At 26, she was warm, confident, and carried herself with the easy grace of someone used to being noticed. Friends described her as outgoing, optimistic, and effortlessly friendly. She had once competed in beauty pageants and worked in public relations, but beneath the surface, Leslie was also kind-hearted and sincere. When she answered the listing for the open room at the Dorset Street house, both Lauren and Adrian were quick to welcome her. They believed her cheerful personality would fit right in. The 3 women quickly found a balance. Leslie brought laughter and liveliness, Adrian offered steadiness, and Lauren maintained a quiet order in the home. Adrian continued her demanding engineering job, while Lauren kept up her work at the college. They weren't best friends in the deepest sense, but there was respect between them, a sense of shared independence. Still, there were quiet moments of tension, small differences in personality that never turned into conflict but lingered beneath the surface. As October arrived, the air grew cooler, and the days shorter. Napa prepared for Halloween like any small town, decorations in shop windows, pumpkins on porches, and quiet streets at dusk. For the roommates, Halloween 2004 was supposed to be simple. There were no big parties planned. Leslie had been seeing her boyfriend, but things between them were uncertain. Adrian planned to stay in that night, and Lauren expected a quiet evening. Yet, outside the comfort of that home, something was shifting, something invisible to them. Unbeknownst to any of the women, one of the people within their wider circle carried a darkness he had managed to keep hidden. He had shared meals with them, attended gatherings, and even stood beside them in photos. No one could have guessed that beneath the quiet surface, resentment and jealousy were building in silence. But on Dorset Street, life continued undisturbed. Leslie's laughter still filled the living room. Adrian's papers still covered the dining table. Lauren's dog, Chloe, still barked at the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk. It was a normal home in a normal neighborhood, until the night that normalcy was torn away forever. October 31st, 2004, was a Sunday night. On Dorset Street, the three women were winding down from a long weekend. Leslie had spent part of the evening speaking with friends and exchanging text messages with her boyfriend, Jim. Adrian stayed in her room, scrolling through work files and planning for the coming week. Lauren, downstairs, watched television while her dog, Chloe, rested near her feet. By 10 p.m., the street was nearly silent. The only sounds were the distant hum of passing cars and the occasional bark of a neighborhood dog. Around 11, Lauren turned off the lights, locked the door, and went upstairs to her room. She slept on the ground floor, while Leslie and Adrian shared the upper level. Sometime after midnight, the peace broke. Chloe began to growl, a deep, uneasy sound that pulled Lauren from sleep. At first, she thought the dog had heard something outside, maybe an animal or a car door. But then the growl turned sharper. Chloe stood, ears stiff, staring toward the stairs. The silence stretched on, long enough that she started to drift back to sleep. But moments later, a new sound came, a faint rustle, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard from above. Lauren froze. The sound came again, louder this time. Her heart began to pound. Then she heard a scream. It was high, short, and piercing, and it sounded like Adrian's voice. The next few seconds blurred. Then there was another silence. Lauren grabbed her phone, hands trembling as she dialed 911. The call didn't go through. Her cell signal failed inside the house. Chloe barked again, louder this time, and the noise seemed to echo off the walls. Lauren whispered for the dog to be quiet. She pressed herself against the wall, listening to what sounded like footsteps on the stairs. Someone was in the house. She stayed perfectly still, trying hard to control her breaths. The footsteps stopped midway. Minutes passed, though to her, it felt like hours. The quiet returned, but it was different now. It was heavy. She could feel the weight of it pressing through the floor. She reached for her keys. If she could make it to her car, she could call for help. She slipped her phone and wallet into her pocket, clipped the dog's leash, and crept toward the front door. Her hands shook so badly that she nearly dropped the keys. She turned the knob slowly, praying it wouldn't squeak, and stepped into the cool night. The air was cold, sharp, and carried the faint scent of earth. She ran barefoot to her car, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway. As she drove toward a nearby streetlight, she finally managed to get a signal. Her voice shook as she told the 911 operator that something terrible had happened in her house. She didn't know what exactly, but she knew that her friends were still inside, and something was very wrong. Lauren's car stopped beneath a flickering streetlight just a few blocks away. The operator on the other end of the line urged her to stay put, But Lauren couldn't silence the thought that her friends might still be alive, waiting for help. She was shaking. Her heart was racing. The dispatcher promised that officers were on the way, but the minutes stretched endlessly. She sat there, frozen, staring back at the dark outline of the house on Dorset Street. Every instinct told her to drive away, but something stronger pulled her back. She couldn't leave them inside alone. When she returned, the front door stood slightly ajar. The porch light flickered, casting faint light across the entryway. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and Chloe's low whine near the door. Lauren stepped inside cautiously, her phone still in her hand, whispering to the dispatcher that she was going back in. The living room looked untouched. The staircase ahead, however, was smeared with dark stains. She felt her knees weaken. The dog refused to go further, pulling back on the leash. Still, Lauren climbed the stairs, one step at a time, whispering Adrian's name. Halfway up, she heard a faint sound. It was soft, almost like someone breathing. She called Adrian's name, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She reached the top landing and froze. Adrian's door was wide open. The scene inside was something no one could prepare for. Blood covered the floor, the bed, and the walls. Adrian lay near the side of her bed, her body twisted, her arms limp, her head turned toward the door. Lauren dropped to her knees beside her, whispering her name again and again, but there was no response. Then for a moment, she noticed Adrian's chest rise slightly. It appeared she was still breathing faintly. Lauren wanted to help, but she didn't know how. The wounds were deep, and there was too much blood. Then, in the corner of the room, she saw Leslie. Her body was face down, surrounded by torn bedding and scattered clothes. The entire space was chaotic, drawers half open, lamps knocked over, curtains torn. It looked like a war had taken place in what had been, just hours earlier, a quiet home. Lauren staggered backward, slipping on the wet floor. She scrambled to her feet, ran downstairs, and tried the kitchen phone, but the line was dead. Her cell had lost signal again, leaving her alone, shaking, her clothes now stained with blood. She ran outside a second time, jumped into her car, and drove until she could reconnect with emergency services. By the time officers arrived, it was close to 3 a.m. Police cruisers lined the quiet residential street, their lights washing the houses in red and blue. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, unsure of what was happening. Napa hadn't seen a murder in years. The idea of one, let alone two, felt unthinkable. Inside, first responders found a scene so violent that even veteran officers struggled to describe it. Detectives chose to enter through an upstairs window rather than disturb the trail that ran through the house. By dawn, the street was blocked off. Investigators photographed every inch of the property. The bodies of Leslie Matsara and Adrian Insogna were carefully removed, and the house, once filled with laughter, fell into complete silence. As dawn broke over Napa on November 1, 2004, police vehicles still surrounded the house on Dorset Street. Yellow tape marked off the yard, and crime scene technicians moved carefully through the property. Lauren Mianza sat in a nearby patrol car wrapped in a blanket, her dog Chloe pressed against her leg. Detectives spoke to her softly, asking for every detail she could recall. Inside, investigators began the painstaking process of documenting the scene. Blood patterns on the walls told a story of struggle. The killer had likely entered through a rear window, which was left unlocked. A flower bed beneath it showed impressions of shoe prints. Fibers and blood traces were recovered from the window sill. Despite the violent nature of the attack, there were no clear fingerprints, no weapon, and no sign that anything had been stolen. The medical examiner later confirmed what detectives already suspected. Both women had been stabbed repeatedly. Leslie Matsara sustained multiple wounds to her upper body and arms, suggesting she had tried to defend herself. Adrienne Insogna's injuries were even more severe. She had fought hard. There were defensive cuts on her hands and arms, proof that she had tried to fend off her attacker until the end. Investigators also discovered a crucial clue: blood that did not belong to either victim. It was found near the kitchen and on the window frame where the intruder had entered and exited. The DNA profile indicated it came from a white male of European descent. It was the first solid lead, proof that the killer had been injured during the attack. Forensic teams collected more than 260 pieces of potential evidence. Everything from cigarette butts found outside to microscopic fibers from clothing. Every item was bagged, tagged, and logged. But without a suspect to match the DNA, the evidence alone could not identify the killer. Meanwhile, word of the double homicide spread quickly through Napa and beyond. Residents locked their doors for the first time in years. Detectives began interviewing anyone who had known the three women. Friends, co-workers, and acquaintances were all questioned. Over 1,300 people were interviewed in the following weeks, and 200 DNA samples were taken. None matched the sample found at the crime scene. Despite the scale of the investigation, leads began to dry up. There were no eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage, and no clear motive. The violence seemed personal, filled with rage. Detectives began to suspect that the killer might have known one or both of the victims. By the third week after the murders, frustration had begun to set in. Investigators had combed through every piece of physical evidence. Hundreds of interviews had led to nothing. The small comfort of Napa's usual calm had vanished. Detectives worked long hours inside the temporary command center set up near the police station, staring at maps, phone records, and forensic reports that all pointed nowhere. The few clues they had were stubbornly vague: a bloody fingerprint that yielded no match, a DNA sample with no identity, and 2 cigarette butts found just outside the house. None of the 3 women smoked. That detail alone suggested the killer had stood outside, waiting, possibly for hours, before entering the house. Detectives, under increasing pressure, began to widen their approach, and tips started to flood in concerning the case. Among the hundreds of tips that flooded in, one stood out. A psychic from the Bay Area named Michael Perry contacted police, claiming he could feel the presence of the 2 victims. At first, detectives were reluctant, but the case had gone cold, and the community's demand for answers was relentless. So they decided to listen. Michael Perry described vivid impressions of the house without ever having visited it. He said he sensed fear, confusion, and betrayal. He spoke as if the victims were still trying to communicate. Lauren Mianza, the surviving roommate, agreed to meet him at the police station, curious but cautious. During that session, Perry mentioned a man with a goatee, someone connected to both Adrienne and Leslie. He even sketched the man's face. The drawing was added to the case file, though no one expected much from it. Then, something stranger happened. Perry asked Lauren, "Who is Lily?" The name struck her. Lily Prudhomme had been Adrienne's best friend, someone she trusted deeply, someone who had even helped them move into the house months earlier. But Perry said he felt the name was connected somehow to the killer. Both Lauren and detectives dismissed it as coincidence. Still, the mention was logged, and so were the names of Lily and her boyfriend, a quiet man named Eric Koppel. Eric was a land surveyor who kept to himself. He had attended Adrienne's housewarming months earlier and had known both victims casually. His name appeared briefly on a checklist of people to interview and test for DNA, but before that could happen, the lead detective on the case was reassigned. The case list was handed over to another investigator, and somewhere in that transfer, Eric's name was never followed up. By early 2005, Napa had moved back into a fragile routine. Restaurants reopened, tourists returned, but the weight of the unsolved murders still lingered. The police department continued to promise progress, yet behind closed doors, detectives were no closer to finding the man who had brutally taken the lives of Adrian Insogna and Leslie Matsara. Nearly a year passed before any real progress was made. The investigation had grown quiet, and many believed the case would never be solved. Then, during the summer of 2005, a forensic technician revisiting the evidence decided to re-examine 2 cigarette butts collected from outside the house on Dorset Street. When the technician extracted DNA from the filters and compared it to the unidentified blood found inside the house, the results were undeniable. The samples matched. The discovery reignited the investigation. Detectives realized the cigarettes might be more than just discarded evidence. They were a rare brand, Camel Turkish Gold, introduced to the market only months before Halloween 2004. Detectives decided to use that detail publicly, hoping someone in the community might connect it to a smoker they knew. The announcement sparked new interest. Local media ran images of the cigarette pack, and tips began coming in again. Among those watching the news was Lauren Mianza, the sole survivor. When she saw the update, something clicked in her mind. She remembered someone, Eric Koppel, Lily Prudhomme's boyfriend. Lauren hesitated before contacting detectives. Eric had always seemed gentle, even shy. He wasn't aggressive, rarely spoke in groups, and often let Lily take the lead in conversation. But the thought of him smoking those exact cigarettes stuck with her. When she called the police to share her concern, they checked the database and discovered something surprising. Eric's DNA had never been collected. His name, once listed for follow-up months earlier, had simply been overlooked. Detectives reached out to him through routine channels, but before they could bring him in, the pressure around Eric began to build. The moment the brand of cigarettes was mentioned, he knew the truth would soon surface. His wife, Lily, noticed him pacing at night, often staring out the window for long stretches of time. On September 22, 2005, police made a public appeal, releasing photos of the cigarettes again and renewing calls for anyone with information to come forward. That same day, Eric sat at his kitchen table, writing letters to his family. They were short, almost emotionless, but in them, he confessed that he was responsible for something terrible. He didn't explain why, only that he could no longer live with the weight of it. His family found the letters before he could act on suicidal thoughts. They convinced him to turn himself in to the Napa Police Department. On October 27, 2005, nearly a year to the day after the murders, Eric Koppel quietly walked into the station and surrendered. When detectives ran his DNA against the sample from the crime scene, the result came back positive. The same man who had sat through candlelight vigils, who had mourned beside Adrian's grieving friends, was the killer. For the investigators, the revelation was shocking. Eric had no criminal record, no violent history, and no known conflict with the victims. But as they began to dig deeper into his life, a different picture emerged. One marked by insecurity, jealousy, and a quiet resentment toward the very people who had shown him kindness. When Eric Koppel finally sat across from detectives in the interrogation room, he appeared calm. His hands were folded, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no attempt to deny what he had done. Investigators listened as he quietly recounted the events of that Halloween night in 2004. He admitted to entering the house through the basement window. He said he had smoked 2 cigarettes while standing outside, working up the nerve. He described how he found Adrian Insogna asleep upstairs, and how a sudden wave of anger overtook him. When pressed for an explanation, his words were vague. He spoke of resentment, of feeling excluded, of unresolved tension between himself and the women, particularly Adrian. Detectives would later discover that Adrian and his wife, Lily, had been close friends, and that Eric had grown increasingly jealous of their bond. He felt invisible, overshadowed, and insecure. Those feelings, buried for months, had festered into rage. After attacking Adrian, he turned on Leslie Matsara, who had awakened to the sounds of the struggle. She tried to flee, but he cornered her. The violence that followed was swift and frenzied. When it was over, he left through the same basement window, bleeding from his hand where the knife had slipped. He drove home, washed the blood off his clothes, and hid the weapon. The detectives sat in silence as he finished. There was no visible remorse in his expression, only exhaustion. When asked why he had attended the funerals, why he had held Lily as she cried, why he had stood with the victims' families while knowing what he had done, he simply said he didn't know. He wanted to believe it hadn't happened. The confession stunned everyone who heard it. In court documents later released, prosecutors described Eric Koppel as a man living a double life, outwardly gentle, inwardly volatile. His surrender had spared the families from a prolonged trial, but the damage was irreversible. In January 2007, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was filled with grief and disbelief. Family members of both victims stood to speak. Leslie's mother, Kathy Harrington, said she could not understand how someone who had been welcomed into their lives could destroy them so completely. Adrian's father described the pain of knowing his daughter's last moments were filled with fear and confusion. Even Lily Prudhomme, Eric's wife, spoke through tears, saying she still loved him but would never forgive him. Her friendship with Adrian had been pure, she said, and now it would haunt her forever. Outside the courthouse, reporters captured the moment as the families embraced, bound by shared loss. For Napa, a town once synonymous with vineyards and serenity, the ordeal left a scar that time would never fully heal. Halloween decorations disappeared for years. The laughter that once filled the small cul-de-sac on Dorset Street was replaced by silence. The house itself was eventually sold, but it remained a place whispered about, a reminder that even in the safest corners of the world, darkness can find its way in. Today, more than a decade later, those who knew Adrian and Leslie still gather each October to honor them. They light candles, share stories, and remember the lives they lived before that night. As for Eric Koppel, he remains in a California state prison, serving his sentence in near isolation. His name is rarely spoken in Napa now, but his actions reshape the town's memory, a quiet, haunting reminder that behind even the calmest faces, the deepest darkness can hide unseen, waiting for a moment that changes everything. Thank you for coming with me on this deep dive. Do subscribe to the channel if you have not done so. We are on a journey to 100 subscribers. Thank you once again for your time. I will be seeing you on our next episode.